While trade officials in Washington were still preparing a fresh wave of pressure tactics, something far more significant was already unfolding inside a major financial hub in Toronto. Quietly, almost without headlines, 240 Mexican businesses arrived in Canada. Behind closed doors, more than 1,800 corporate meetings took place. Two governments coordinated side by side. And by the end of those discussions, a new strategy had started taking shape, one designed to challenge a core belief inside the Trump administration's trade doctrine. To understand why this development matters so much, everything begins with one number. More than 70% of exports from both Canada and Mexico flow directly into the United States. That figure goes beyond normal commerce. It represents deep structural reliance. And once your largest economic partner becomes impossible to predict, when tariff announcements appear before sunrise, when supply chain contracts depend on late-night social media posts, countries stop waiting for certainty. Instead, they begin constructing stability on their own. They create alternatives. They design leverage. They establish systems capable of operating without approval from Washington. That is exactly what unfolded here. Mexico's Ministry of Economy organized what analysts and officials now describe as the country's biggest commercial mission to Canada in recent memory. Reports from CBC News, together with Mexico Business News, confirmed that during the opening days of May 2026, 240 Mexican firms traveled into Toronto and Montreal over a 2-day period. Most of those participants were small and medium-sized businesses. Their objective was direct engagement with approximately 200 Canadian companies through more than 1,800 business-to-business sessions. The industries represented were anything but secondary. Agriculture, advanced manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, electric mobility, critical minerals, technology, education, and creative sectors all stood at the center of the agenda. These are not fringe markets. These are the foundations of the next North American economic era. Yet remarkably, the framework was being discussed without any American officials participating in the room. Government-level negotiations were hosted inside the headquarters of Scotiabank in Toronto, not at a ministry building, not at an embassy reception. A major Canadian banking institution became the stage. That decision carried a deliberate message. Scotiabank already maintains substantial operations throughout Mexico, and placing the talks there signaled something unmistakable to investors and executives on both sides of the border. This was no symbolic diplomatic ceremony. This was business. Real commercial integration. An open invitation for companies to step inside and participate. Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc delivered carefully chosen remarks during the opening gathering in Toronto. According to reporting from the Globe and Mail, he described the relationship between Canada and Mexico as one rooted in shared values and aligned economic goals that had produced major prosperity over many decades. But the most important phrase came later. Ottawa, he explained, was preparing for what he called a robust and joint review of CUSMA, involving Mexico and the United States together. That single word, joint, carried enormous weight. Joint meant trilateral coordination. Joint meant neither country intended to face Washington independently. Joint meant Canada and Mexico were signaling that future negotiations would happen together rather than one nation being isolated and pressured separately. And here's the detail many mainstream reports barely touched. The Toronto mission did not emerge overnight. It represented the latest move in a carefully organized sequence that had been developing since at least September 2025. That was when Prime Minister Mark Carney traveled to Mexico City and, alongside President Claudia Sheinbaum, introduced what both governments officially named the Canada-Mexico Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. From that announcement came a structured roadmap called the Canada-Mexico Action Plan, 2025 through 2028. The framework covered trade facilitation, agriculture, infrastructure, innovation, energy, natural resources, education, health, and security cooperation. According to the official joint statement later published by the Government of Canada following the May trade mission, ministers from both countries reaffirmed their intention to keep advancing that roadmap forward. This was not improvised diplomacy. It was a long-term architecture assembled piece by piece. Then came February 2026. Canada launched what the Trade Commissioner Service described as one of the largest Canadian trade delegations to Mexico in decades. Nearly 400 Canadian business leaders joined more than 240 companies traveling across Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey. The delegation included 3 federal ministers, 4 parliamentary secretaries, and 2 provincial ministers. Coverage from Policy Magazine and the Business Council of Canada later confirmed that those visits generated real operational agreements already functioning on the ground. A fully integrated trilateral rail corridor now transports bonded cargo directly from Canada into Mexico. Airlines, meanwhile, expanded both freight and passenger connections, linking multiple cities across the 2 countries. Step by step, quietly and methodically, a parallel commercial infrastructure had begun taking shape across North America. Not to replace the United States entirely, but to reduce vulnerability to it. And that is precisely why the development unsettled assumptions inside Washington. Over the past 10 years, Canadian investment flowing into Mexico has expanded to nearly 3 times its previous scale. Inside Mexico's mining industry, companies from Canada now represent almost 3/4 of all foreign capital tied to the sector. The trade mission Mexico launched in May was not a symbolic gesture. It was a direct response to everything that had already been set in motion, and it pushed the relationship even further. Reporting from the Globe and Mail revealed that Mexico's Secretary of Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, conducted high-level meetings in Toronto with executives from Air Canada, Bombardier, Brookfield Corporation, and Canadian National Railway. Additional discussions were scheduled between Mexican corporations and major Canadian investment institutions, including the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, one of the largest pension funds anywhere in the world. That was far beyond diplomacy for cameras. This was institutional money being drawn into a growing bilateral trade corridor intentionally structured to expand without relying on the United States as the central route. Luis Arzani, Chief Commercial Officer of Grupo Express International, explained to CBC News what that strategy means in practical terms. His logistics firm is pursuing a system where cargo can be loaded in Mexico and delivered directly into Canada through one unified operational chain managed by a single contact point. No American intermediary, no vulnerability to sudden tariff swings coming out of Washington. One continuous cross-border supply line capable of functioning regardless of whatever policy announcement arrives next Tuesday from the White House. That is the real structure of this emerging partnership, and the scale behind it is massive. Official Mexican government figures cited by CBC News showed that bilateral merchandise trade between Canada and Mexico reached roughly $62 billion during 2025. Since NAFTA took effect in 1995, commercial exchange between the two countries has increased more than 12-fold. Meanwhile, Mexican exports headed into Canada alone jumped 17% between 2024 and 2025. Yet both governments openly acknowledge that $62 billion is not the final target. They view it as merely the beginning. So why has this cooperation accelerated with such force right now? Because the countdown has already started. Under Article 34.7 of the USMCA agreement, the governments of Canada, Mexico, and the United States are required to meet by July 1st, 2026, in order to determine whether the trade pact will be extended for another 16 years, shifted into annual review cycles, or left vulnerable to expiration by 2036. A detailed analysis published by CSIS suggested that achieving a straightforward early extension before July 1st now appears increasingly doubtful. And then another signal emerged. In March 2026, review discussions quietly began between Washington and Mexico City without Canadian participation. Later, Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, told a Canadian Chamber of Commerce summit in Ottawa that she expected the United States to negotiate certain matters separately with Canada and Mexico. She described the process as a bilateral snap-on component attached to the broader trilateral structure. That wording matters enormously. The United States is no longer treating the review as one united 3-country negotiation. Instead, the framework is being broken into separate one-on-one conversations. Washington negotiates independently with Ottawa. Washington negotiates independently with Mexico City. Each nation sits alone across the table from the world's most powerful economy. Each side risks surrendering concessions without fully understanding what the other country is being pressured to give away. And by the time those compromises become visible, the deals are already locked in place. It is one of the oldest strategies in geopolitical economic negotiations. Divide opponents, isolate them, extract terms separately. The Canada-Mexico partnership is being constructed specifically to stop that scenario from succeeding. Armando Ortega, who serves as president of the Mexico-Canada Bilateral Committee within the Mexican Business Council for Foreign Commerce, spoke directly to that issue during comments reported by CBC News. Ortega participated in the original NAFTA negotiations decades ago. He recalled how Canada and Mexico previously found shared interests and worked together to pressure the United States into softening positions on several sections of the final agreement. According to him, both countries must repeat that strategy again now. Coordinate closely, remain unified, prevent Washington from extracting concessions from one side without the other, fully understanding what is being sacrificed in return. And Canada increasingly appears to recognize the stakes. CBC News reported that Prime Minister Mark Carney held a phone conversation with President Claudia Sheinbaum during late April in order to align positions before the formal review process begins. Their discussion covered not only CUSMA itself, but the wider Canada-Mexico relationship as a whole. Charette has also made Canada's stance unmistakably clear. Ottawa views tariff disputes and the CUSMA review as interconnected matters that should be negotiated together. The Office of the United States Trade Representative disagrees insisting tariff issues sit outside the review's official boundaries. That clash is not some minor technical disagreement buried inside legal procedure. It represents one of the major fault lines heading directly into the negotiations. And here's the reality neither side can ignore. Canada and Mexico are building leverage. They are creating insulation. They are strengthening direct ties with each other. But even with all of this momentum, neither country is currently capable of replacing the American market entirely. Not within 2 years. Not within 5. The stark reality is that the 70% export dependency between Canada, Mexico, and the United States does not vanish simply because 240 companies traveled to Toronto to hold 1,800 meetings. What has been constructed is not a substitute for the U.S. market. It is leverage. It is the tangible capacity to cushion some of the blow if trade tensions escalate. It sends a signal to Washington's own economic stakeholders, auto manufacturers, agricultural exporters, energy producers, illustrating the real cost of pursuing the most aggressive trade war strategies. Janice Charette framed the July 1st, 2026 deadline in a way that demands serious attention. Speaking at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, she emphasized that the date is a checkpoint, not a cliff. The USMCA does not expire then. Failure to confirm renewal would transition the agreement into annual reviews, leaving it to automatically lapse in 2036 if no resolution emerges over the next decade. The countdown begins, but trade does not halt overnight. Observers are focused on two things: whether the Canada-Mexico coordination proves credible and resilient under pressure, and the trajectory of the review process itself. A 6-scenario analysis from CSIS identifies a painful extension as the most probable baseline outcome. Talks are likely to stretch into late 2026 or beyond. Both Canada and Mexico will have to make concessions on rules of origin, energy market access, and supply chain governance. The deal survives, but it carries tangible costs. Yet the lingering unspoken question hangs over all calculations. What if Washington intervenes midway and presents Canada with a bilateral deal that looks genuinely advantageous? Faster resolution. Relief from tariffs on lumber, aluminum, and manufactured goods. A clean package that alleviates most immediate economic stress. What would be the price of accepting it? Canada would step out of the trilateral coordination, leaving Mexico to face the full weight of Washington's demands alone. Would Canada take that offer? If so, everything arranged in Toronto in May 2026, the 1,800 business meetings, the $62 billion in bilateral trade, the integrated trilateral rail network, the pension fund commitments, would be reduced to a footnote. Mexico would confront a much stronger adversary without a partner at the table. The comprehensive Canada-Mexico action plan, the strategic partnership, the private sector buy-in, everything becomes an expensive lesson in the limits of diplomatic solidarity when economic pressure spikes. Washington is fully aware of this leverage point. The Toronto mission achieved a concrete and measurable outcome. It raised the cost of Canada walking away. It built enduring commercial connections between companies on both sides of the border, embedding Canadian business in the fate of the bilateral relationship. The Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan does not mobilize Marcelo Ebrard across continents for a ceremonial photo. Bombardier and Brookfield do not dispatch executives to meet Mexico's Secretary of Economy purely for optics. These are institutions that act when the commercial rationale is real and substantial. Prime Minister Carney's government is betting that if enough of Canada's private sector has meaningful exposure to the Canada-Mexico partnership, the political cost of abandoning the alliance, and the backlash from domestic business, will make a unilateral sellout far more difficult, even if Washington's offer appears attractive in the short term. Whether that calculation holds is the unresolved question now at the heart of this story. According to analyses from CSIS and the Brookings Institution, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer has already indicated to congressional committees that he will not recommend USMCA renewal to the president without modifications. This is no bluff. It is the position of the official who controls the American side of the review. Washington enters these negotiations expecting to extract significant concessions. The open questions are who will bear the heaviest costs and whether Canada and Mexico can coordinate sufficiently to ensure that neither is isolated in paying alone. What began as a trade mission has evolved into a strategic framework. What may look like routine diplomatic courtesy is in fact a deliberate effort by two G20 nations to prevent the world's most powerful economy from targeting them individually. The unfolding formal negotiations and the moment when real pressure is applied will reveal whether this Canada-Mexico alliance is resilient or merely decorative. Most observers will see headlines, large trade delegation, countless meetings, then move on. But now, the real story is clear. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.